Welcome to a radical discussion of independence, free will, liberty, and the left-hand path. This is Daimonosophy 2.0 with your host, Paul Frederick.
No vision can grasp.
Greetings, friends and fellow daemons, and welcome to episode 23 of Daimonosophy 2.0, the only podcast fighting for liberty and the left-hand path. If you dig the show, please like, comment, and subscribe. You can find us on iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. And for exclusive members-only content, join us on Patreon. As I said, this is episode 23. And if you're an old-school conspiracy buff and fan of William S. Burroughs, such as I am, then you know that 23 is a very significant number associated with conspiracy, synchronicity, and cynicis. Thus it is for this episode, we're bringing back our friend and teacher, Michael Aquino, former Magister of the Church of Satan, founder of the Temple of Set, a Vietnam veteran and retired lieutenant colonel of the U.S. Army PSYOPs Division. Dr. Aquino has written a new book, and it's called The Satanic Bible. That's right, you heard me correctly. Only this is the Satanic Bible 50-year anniversary revision. It's not a rewrite, and it's not a reimagining. Rather, I like to think of it as a clarification, an enhancement, an undoing of ambiguity, and a remanifestation. To be sure, it is a game changer, and no one will ever be able to use those words, Satanic Bible, in quite the same way ever again. But I'll let Dr. Aquino explain that to you himself in this one-of-a-kind conversation.
I want to talk about your new book. You've done this amazing thing. You've issued a revision of the Satanic Bible. So tell us all about that.
The story goes back to 1971, actually, when Anton LaVey was, who'd written his Satanic Bible in 1968 and published it in 1969 with Avon. Mm-hmm. And in 1971, he was doing a companion work called The Satanic Rituals, which he had obviously several more years of time to think about, and was a much more carefully assembled book. And at the same time, he was issuing the Satanic Bible and the Rituals as hardcovers as well through university books. And he had also taken another look at the Satanic Bible, and he was increasingly dissatisfied with it, most immediately with its introduction by Burton Wolfe, which he felt treated the Church of Satan pretty much as a Haight-Ashbury, flash-in-the-pan San Francisco thing, and didn't reflect its actual dignity and potential. Mm-hmm. So he asked me if I would do a new introduction for it, which I did, and that introduction appeared in both the Avon paperback and the new hardcover book in 1972, along with the Satanic Rituals. At the same time, he said that this was just preliminary to his taking another detailed look at the Satanic Bible. He didn't really think that it had been given the assembly care and depth that it justified with a title like that. So he wanted to tackle that as a project with my help in the near future to reissue it. And I said, sure, but then both of us sort of got involved in other projects and other priorities, and taking another look at the Satanic Bible really didn't go anywhere. And of course, in 1975, there was a culmination crisis in the Church of Satan, where it, make a long story short, Anton pretty much changed it into a personal fan club and an atheistic orientation, and I and the original priesthood had resigned from it, went off to found the Temple of Set, which in its place is a successor organization, and the Temple of Set left the Judeo-Christian iconography completely also and went back to that of Set in ancient Egypt. So the original Satanic Bible was something of an orphan. You had a religious document here with no church around it, no religion behind it anymore. It was a sort of a relic of 1968, and yet it was still out there as an Avon pocketbook. The university hardcover went out of print, but the Avon pocketbook continued, and with different interpretations and interests in Satanism over the years, particularly during the times of the Satanic Panic in the 1980s. New generations of people still bought it, read it, sort of assumed that there was a Church of Satan authentically behind it that reflected this religion, and so you had this very odd phenomenon of a sort of a book that manifested itself as a nonfiction work, but there was no nonfiction reality underlying it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Temple of Set, I suppose we just said, well, we'll just let it fade away. It's a piece of the past. And the people who were running the Church of Satan commercial business, particularly after Anton passed on in, I think it was 1997, were just as happy to sit around and collect royalties as they might be from the Avon paperback sales, and to occasionally cite it as a backbone, of the quote-unquote church, but without really paying any attention to its contents in terms of authenticity or whatever. And, of course, the original failings of the book were still there since it hadn't been touched. The background of the book, as I discuss in a preface in this one, is that the Church of Satan as an organization was coming together very rapidly in its first couple of years and becoming something of a media sensation. And Peter Mayer, one of the editors at Avon, called up the LeVays and said, there's a great market here for something like a Satanic Bible. Can you put one together? They said, sure. And they basically slapped one together from the mimeographed handouts that the church was passing out to its membership. And to pad it out and to make it fat enough to actually be printed as a standard paperback, Anton was looking around for something that was seemed to be a kind of a metaphysical statement from Satan or the demonic powers, and he came across an old 19th, early 20th century diatribe pamphlet in a kind of an Ayn Randian flavor by a sort of a racist supremacist fellow by the name of who used the pen name of Ragnar Redbeard, called Might is Right. And he filled up the front part of the Satanic Bible with that and called it the Book of Satan, attributing the rant to Redbeard, or rather attributing it to Satan, and not identifying it as something that wasn't his own work at the same time. So people who bought the Satanic Bible assumed that Anton had just written this on behalf of Satan. And then to pad the back part of it, he found John Dee's Enochian Keys, which were again, really didn't have anything as they were to do with classical Satanism. They were a sort of a self-examination incantation that John Dee had come up with during the times of Elizabeth I, and if anything were more angelic than satanic, and had been reprinted accordingly down through the years by organizations such as the original Golden Dawn, and then Aleister Crowley in his Equinox, and added that to the back of the Satanic Bible, just sort of changed all the God references to Satan ones, and used the 19 incantations as sort of theme exhortations, what Aleister Crowley would refer to as barbarous words of evocation. Namely, if you got to the end of a ritual and you wanted something spooky to kind of punctuate it with, then you went back and found the appropriate Enochian key that Anton said was for curses or for sympathy or for making money or whatever, and then you spoke that at the back of your ritual, and that made it suitably spooky. And that, plus the Redbeard thing, fattened it up enough so that he had a passable paperback, and that was how the original Satanic Bible came together. He also pretty much co-did this, co-slapped it together with his wife Diane, who mentioned that she typed the whole thing up on her $29 typewriter, and got it in a form to send it back to Peter Mayer so that Avon could publish it. Well, that brings us up to the present time where over the years, despite the fact that the Temple of Set had completely separated from Satanism, we still had inherited, the mantle of our previous 10 years as the Church of Satan, as the legitimate Church of Satan, which has nothing to do with the business concern that pretends to be that today. And I had, for example, written a history of the Church of Satan, published it as a book under that name, The Church of Satan, which has been a very successful book and of course recounts the organization's history during the 1966 to 1975 period. Well, after 1975, I still had some of the notes that I had made to myself concerning ways in which the Satanic Bible might be fixed up a bit. And in the years after that, occasionally, for almost inexplicable reasons, I would make a few more notes. I'd notice the volume and say, well, if I were going to do something, well, I would do this instead or do that instead. So a few months ago, around the turn of this year or so, I happened to mention this to Anton LaVey's grandson, Stanton Zaharoff LaVey, nice young gentleman living in Southern California. And he has always been very interested in his grandfather's legacy. And he said, gee, I'd sure like to see some of those notes and draft things that you were talking about. So I said, well, okay. So I picked up a selection of them and emailed them to him, and he wrote back to me and he said, gosh, this is neat stuff. He says, I think this should really go ahead. And he says, I don't think that this should just be allowed to die. And I said, well, for one thing, I can't re-edit Anton's Satanic Bible because it was a copyrighted book under his name, and the copyright's controlled by the people who got control of his copyright after his passing. And they're certainly not going to be interested in my doing something like that, nor would I want to do something like that for a book that's under the control of an insincere bunch of atheists. And he says, well, is the title copyrighted? And I said, well, no, the book titles aren't copyrightable. And he says, well, let's just write a whole new one. I said, well, I don't know. So to make a long story short, I began playing with that as an idea and doing it from the standpoint of kind of like first of all, as a sort of an archivist, who was looking back at this book and assessing it and saying, here was this previous book, and we had talked about reconsidering it and redoing it, and here's how it sort of I think it would have come out if we had actually gotten around to doing something like that. So, to make a long story short, I messed around with that, and when I was through messing, it was a little bit like Baron Frankenstein, who was sewing together body parts on the table, and finally there's a lightning storm, and the thing twitches and sits up, and here's Baron Frankenstein in the movie screaming, "It's alive! It's alive!" Right. So I turned around and looked at this and sort of said, well, "It's alive!" Right. And
when I first heard about it, I heard that something like this was going on. I thought, what's that going to look like? But then, I got this copy of it that you provided me with, and I started reading through it. And one of the first things that stood out to me was, I'm glad you mentioned the infernal diatribe. So the Book of Satan, which you've referred to now as Satan Gloria Ignis. And I remember, I'm one of I bought the Satanic Bible, that Avon edition. That was my introduction to all of this when I was 13 years old, circa 1982. And one of the first things I saw in that book was in the Book of Satan. There's this infernal diatribe, and it sounds like he's saying that these are the words of Satan himself. That's really strongly implied there. And that just stirred my imagination at the time. And so then contrast that with, 15 or so years later, it becomes common knowledge that this was just lifted from someone else. Ragnar read, it's lifted from a different book. Not only is it not Satan's words, but it's not even really Anton LaVey's words. So you coming along and in your re-envisioning of this, replacing that with the Diabolicon, which is a document which is, absolutely smacks of authenticity from, the infernal nether regions, is just absolutely appropriate. And then as I go through reading the rest of the book, everything that you've done with it, the way it follows the same structure, it follows the same spirit of it, but it goes beyond it, and it goes deeper to sort of uncover those really authentic aspects of it that we really always wished were there,
Yeah, well, that was the idea that I went at it with, and quite frankly, if Anton LaVey were alive, and if he and I had reconciled, and we'd ever gotten together on a project like this, I think that this is very much like what would have sat up on the table if we both sat down and put our heads together on it. Mm-hmm. So I have no conscience pangs at all about something that is, that would reflect, like a rip-off of him or anything like that. This is, I think, a kind of a fulfillment of something that we had just sort of set aside as a project, and he isn't here at the moment, but I think if he were here, I think he'd like it. And as I said, I think that in his more sophisticated ways, this is something that he would have been much more satisfied with than the original book, which, as I said, was sort of thrown together in a hurry to meet Avon's demands for an instant paperback. Mm-hmm. And yes, you bring up the Diabolicon. The Diabolicon's history is recounted in the backstory chapter of that part of it. And it was a religious working, a magical working, in which I had I don't like the word channeling, because it sounds sort of cheap and self-serving, but let's just say that I kind of stretched my head, I thought, in the direction of what Satan and his principal demons would think and would say, and then wrote that down in a way that satisfied me, that wasn't insulting to my concept of them at the time. So that's the Diabolicon came to be as a sort of a response or reinterpretation of John Milton's Paradise Lost, which was shortly after I had joined the Church of Satan in 1969, and I was looking around for various source documents to read. I found that really there wasn't anything like a religious statement by Satan about his ideas. The most that you found were sort of sardonic criticisms of Earth, things like this, by people like Mark Twain in his Letters to the Earth, or Taylor Caldwell, Dialogues with the Devil, where Satan is arguing things out with Michael about what a mistake God made when he created man, and so on. Mm-hmm. And that really didn't do it. There's a lot of heroism in John Milton's Paradise Lost, but of course John Milton was coming at it from the standpoint of the Judeo-Christian Bible and Christian doctrine. So Satan was sort of pre-programmed to be the loser, the guy who made the mistake, who wound up at the short end of the stick, so to speak. And that just didn't sit right with me. And I remember thinking, I said, well, there's always two sides to the story. So I wonder if I can understand what Satan's side of the same story would be. And that's kind of how the Diabolicon came together. And it was a little more bizarre because it was 1969, 1970. I was in Special Forces operations in Southeast Asia. And I was writing this thing kind of extemporaneously in a few leisure moments that I had in various operations out in the backwoods of South Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and so on. So it was very weird that way. But that's how it came together. And when I finally got the whole thing done to the point where I was satisfied with it, then I rewrote it in a nice manuscript and mailed it off to Anton LaVey in San Francisco, and his letter of response is cited in this book. He was very impressed with it. He wanted it to be central to the Church of Satan, and indeed it was for the rest of the organization's time. It was used in the priesthood ordination ceremony and other important ceremonies and rituals of the church. He actually came very close to creating a separate volume of it in cooperation with Peter Mayer at that 1972 time. But then again, other projects sort of got in the way. So had he received your copy of the Diabolicon before the first Satanic Bible publication? No. Mm-mm. No. Okay. I received he sent me a copy of the first Satanic Bible when it was first issued by Avon, which would have been roughly around November of 1969. Okay. He assembled it around 1968, and then it took Avon a better part of a year or so to actually put it out there. And I wrote the Diabolicon in early 1970. And I really wasn't thinking about the Satanic Bible one way or the other when I was working on the Diabolicon it was there, like you. I took the Ragnar Redbeard thing as a diatribe by Anton on behalf of Satan, but again, it didn't say the kinds of metaphysical things that I personally was interested in, I suppose. I wanted to know what the secrets of the universe were as Satan understood them, so to speak, and what the significance of humanity was, and why we're here, so to speak, what we can do with ourselves. And the might is right thing is is a grouchy rant, sort of an Ayn Rand kind of thing.
Very angry.
Sort of a Conan the Barbarian, beating on your chest and then, dragging women off into your cave, so to speak.
He even has a broad axe in it, too.
Oh, yes. Well, as a matter of fact, there's an entire chapter of the Redbeard Might is Right, in which he goes on about women and how they should be subjected and brought to heel as, good sexual pets and things like this. And I always used to kid him, and I said, I guess that if you'd put that in there, Diane would have had you sleeping out on the couch for the next 6 months. Yeah, you got that right. So that was Might is Right. I mean, it was a pulpit pounding Aryan Superman speech that that would be appropriate to a Conan movie, I guess. But it didn't really answer my kinds of questions, and that's why I undertook the Diabolicon working.
Sure. Another thing that I really like is the indulgence and brimstone piece, where you kind of go through the 9 satanic statements and reiterate these in terms of indulgence.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, first of all, of course, I could not, if I didn't want to cross copyright problems, I can't very well just copy the 9 satanic statements. And indeed, I didn't entirely like all of them. I thought, some of them had interesting points to make. Some of them were a little on the casual side, like Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had because he's kept it in business all these years. Well,
yeah.
That's a little, a bit of a cheap shot kind of thing. So
right.
I said to myself, well, Anton's 5th degree word, his magical word as a magus, was indulgence, expanded to indulgence instead of abstinence. So why don't I look at the various ideas that the 9 satanic statements brought out in terms of the concept of indulgence and see what comes of that. So I came up with 9 focused statements around the term and the concept of indulgence and put that in its place. And that symbol that sits on top of the page that was in the original Satanic Bible is the old alchemical symbol for brimstone. And there was no reason to put that on that page in the original Satanic Bible. I guess for some reason they just felt like putting an emblem on that page, and put the brimstone emblem, which sort of looks like an Eastern Orthodox cross with an infinity curlicue at the bottom. And he didn't explain it. Nobody was curious about it. I don't think anybody even paid much attention to it, except that it was there. So when I got to this, I said, well, let's resurrect old Mr. Brimstone and call this by that name, and that kind of gives it a little bit of historical nostalgia, for the initial volume, but gives it a little tweak of color. So that's how I renamed it that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's excellent. I also like that you added this 5th section, Yankee Rose, because the original Satanic Bible, had these 4 sections, Satan, Lucifer, Belial, Leviathan, kind of corresponding to the 4 elements. And it ended with that mysterious word, Yankee Rose, that, for me initially when I read this, no one had any idea what that could possibly have meant. It was just this huge mystery kind of tacked on to the very end of it all. And it gave you that sense that, I bet there's this whole other story behind this. And so the fact that you come along and you put this whole extra section dealing with that is just excellent. And so one of the things that you talk about in there is City of Dreadful Night, which is kind of a recounting of the history of the Black House. And apparently there was a secret gateway to hell.
Yes. Well, I think that today, for today's audiences who didn't live through the Haight-Ashbury era, don't know about the original church weren't there for it. And of course, the house itself is gone now. It's disappeared, and now there's this really blasé, looking condominium in its place. They even changed the house number on it. I think it's 6118 now because they don't want the association of the old address. It's a little bit like that.
Wow.
I think I quoted in there, that line from Lovecraft where the gods had cursed the king of Runegar or something so that he would not only cease to be but cease ever to have been. The ultimate of curses. And to me, the history of the Church of Satan was bound up in that house because Anton and Diane had really redid the thing, redecorated it and reconfigured it as a nice, spooky Satan house and kind of a fun house in many ways. And you really can't get into the flavor of the Church of Satan without appreciating the house. At least it seems to me that way. If they'd been living in an apartment in Daly City while they did the whole thing, it just wouldn't have been the same.
Right.
And so I had this kind of, I said, if I'm going to do this Satanic Bible, then for people to really kind of grok it, I need to tell a little bit about the house, that kind of surrounded this thing, a little bit like the house of Rotwang in Thea Bonharbu's Metropolis, where this crazed inventor who came up with the famous Robotrix to overthrow society lived in this really bizarre little magician's house in the middle of this ultra fancy futuristic city. So I added Yankee Rose as a new section to the book, which is sort of a little historical profile of the house. Not as detailed a tour of it as I gave in my Church of Satan book, of course, but enough to, I think, give the new reader who's unfamiliar with it a bit of the flavor, and then, of course, to finish it off with a bit of a Lovecraftian yarn, to give people a little fun trip there. And there were lines in there that I simply couldn't just not write, like, Anton and Diane, LaVey were like any other pleasant young married couple in the Richmond district, with 2 daughters and a lion. I mean, you can't make up stuff like this, right?
Right.
So then I put a little footnote there, about Togari the lion, and he was, the house pet. He started out like a big cat and wound up as a much bigger cat, and then when his roaring began keeping the neighbors awake, he finally went down to Tippi Hedren's preserve down by L.A., where he spent his later years with other lions and tigers and things. But it was a story that I thought needed to be told with a little background as to spooky San Francisco and indeed the spooky state of California, because there's a lot of creepy weirdness about this state and a lot of creepy weirdness about San Francisco. It's a little bit like H.P. Lovecraft, who, if you read some of his stories and then you look around New England, you say, this is a weird area. It's got Innsmouth and Dunwich and all this stuff going on here, so it isn't just a normal state. I mean, this is a creepy part of the United States. So I said, well, California is creepy too, and this is sort of the culmination of its creepiness. So I gave everybody a little background of some of the weird stuff in California. There's a story, there's articles in the Los Angeles Times where there were excavations under Los Angeles to find this big lizard city underneath where the L.A. Dodger Stadium is in Chavez Ravine. That's all true. I mean, it sounds like it was invented, but it's if you go back and you look in the old issues of the L.A. Times, the articles are all there, about the excavations that were going to take place. It wasn't followed up, so either the excavation found something and was gobbled up by monsters, or it didn't find anything and the Times didn't bother to report it. You have to figure that one out for yourself. Depends on how far into the basements of Dodger Stadium you care to go. A little bit like the Opera House in Paris. If you want to keep going down there, you'll definitely find all those caverns that Gaston Leroux was talking about when he wrote The Phantom of the Opera. They're there. He just took advantage of them and wrote his story. But the sub basements going all the way down there in the Paris Opera House are there. Again, some of the stuff you can't make up. So when I was, my tale in there about these caverns and giant networks of underground tubes and sewers and things that underlie the Richmond district, this is all true. The place is a giant warren of this stuff, and it all goes out to the edge of San Francisco by what's called Sea Cliff, where the Sutro Bath ruins are. And the Temple of Set used to hold occasional nameless rites, out there under Magister Eric Caution and the Order of the Trapezoid, down by some of these caves, and some of them caves have since been cemented over and bricked up, I guess, to keep Cthulhu inside instead of coming out and ravaging San Francisco. But this is all stuff you can go see for yourself. It's there. The truth is stranger than fiction kind of thing.
Well, and then there's sinkholes too, right? There's an occasional danger.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, that's when we get some of these big rains and things out here during flood season. The entire Sea Cliff and Richmond area in San Francisco is kind of infamous for having these giant sinkholes appear where a whole half of a street block suddenly goes boom, down there. And what's happened is that one of these big sewer tunnels and, or storm drains down there has just simply collapsed because of the water pressure or whatever. And they don't really discuss that in the news media around here. Nobody mentions this big thing. I guess they don't want to get everybody out there excited that they're living over this big Swiss cheese thing.
It might kind of affect the property values out there.
Something like that, yeah. But anyway, this does happen out here occasionally, and oops, there goes a piece of Richmond again, and you see a photo or something on the news, and there's half a block that's just boom, like this. And San Francisco just seems to take it as a matter of course, like, oh, okay, so what else is new and what's for dinner tonight? And then they rebuild it and pad it up, and life goes on. But yeah, the after the 1906 earthquake and fire, see, people don't understand what a weird thing this city is. It's mostly it's built on a bunch of sand dunes for most of it on its main part, but then there are a few granite hills that stick up around the top edges, one of which I'm fortunately living on myself, which is why we don't have any earthquake problems here. But the eastern area of the city, down by the financial district that goes out into San Francisco Bay, is this huge graveyard of dead ships that all sank in place there at the time of the 1849 gold rush, the 49ers. People heard there was gold out here, and everybody who could got on a ship, came here, parked it at the waterfront, dashed off it, and went running up to mine gold. And this huge assemblage of ships just rotted in place out here and finally all just kind of sank in place and then was sort of built over. And that's what you see the financial district here in the city today, blocks and blocks and blocks, which is all just this huge graveyard of ships underneath. And every once in a while somebody builds a new skyscraper, and when they're digging down to make the foundations of the things, next thing you know, they say, oh, we just found the masts of a ship down here and a keg of rum and stuff like this, and you find out that about that part of the city. Well, after the 1906 fire and earthquake, there was a lot of concern about water evacuation and water tunnels, things like this, And the area that they chose to do all this major work in was the Richmond area, which is sort of the top part of San Francisco. It's just below the Presidio, but north of Golden Gate Park, and it's out towards the west coast there of the Land's End area of beaches. So they began digging all that up and constructing all these storm drains and things down there. There's this particularly huge one that's big enough to drive a car through, and indeed when it was constructed, they did drive a car through it with the mayor and everybody else, from one end to the other. They got all the way out to the cliffs where the thing emptied into the Pacific Ocean, and they held their little commissioning ceremony there, so to speak. And then after the mayor had left, they actually had to back the car all the way through the tunnel because there was no way to turn it around or do anything else with it. It was just hanging out over a cliff there. So that's a little piece of San Francisco's bizarre history. And with 6114, California Street, the Black House, sitting right smack on top of this Lovecraftian monstrosity down there of all this horrible stuff. So when Anton showed me this big hatch there in the basement of the house, or it was actually sort of the ground floor of the house because there was no basement. And he said, well, this, basically is an access, to all that, big system down there. And he says it's, never tried to climb down and explore it, but there it is, And I said, that's kind of cool, but again, it was a conversation topic that were chewing over one evening, and that's so I recounted that and Lovecrafted it up a little bit for the book to give people some fun.
No, it's excellent. I love that part of it. And, the Black House and how it's all interwoven in with the history of San Francisco makes me think about, like, the West, and magical lore and stuff. There's all this stuff about the West. Look to the West, and all of this, the location of all of this, the magic of place, if you will, is all very much, it's about as, it's about as west as you can get.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know what it is about of course, the sun goes west, and everybody wants to chase after it, I suppose, since the times of ancient Egypt. But, of course, you've got Atlantis, that's out there in the ocean, and you've got, then, of course, there's America, and I've got a wonderful quote in there from William Burroughs, who was, of course, one of the greats of the Beats era here, and became a violent, great author, also a violent drug addict, and wound up, dead in Mexico, I think, at some point from drug overdosing and so on. But he said, America is, I don't know these exactly, but it was something like, America is not a young country. It's old and evil and dirty, before the settlers, before the Indians. And then he said, the evil is there waiting. And I said, oh, God, I love it. I got to put this in there,
Yeah.
So sure, when you're looking around for spooky America, you wind up on the West Coast, and here's California, and then you wind up in the spookiest of the cities, which is San Francisco, and you go to the westernmost part of it, and you wind up in the Richmond out there by the Sutro ruins of the old spooky Sutro baths, and that's about as west you can get, unless you want to go out to Hawaii, where the Temple of Set has had nameless rites and unspeakable orgies out there with volcanoes and things. So.
Oh yes.
So
and I believe
that's that.
And I believe the West and the cosmology of the Satanic Bible, that corresponds with Leviathan, right? The Book of Leviathan.
Well, there was no calendar thing associated with those names in the Satanic Bible. Those four names, Satan, Lucifer, Belial, Leviathan, actually popped up in a 19th century, early 20th century book by the Order of the Golden Dawn's Samuel L. McGregor Mathers. He was a sort of a predecessor, a bit of a mentor of Aleister Crowley for a while. And Mathers did a lot of research in Paris, and he found this old volume called The Sacred Magic of Abram, Mellon, the Mage, which was a nice, spooky, sort of Kabbalistically kind of thing. He did an English translation of it, which was published. And in that book, for no particular reason, Satan, Lucifer, Belial, and Leviathan were identified as the quote-unquote 4 crown princes of hell. Mm-hmm. And that sort of became an icon phrase, and you can immediately object and say, well, Satan and Lucifer are the same thing, and Leviathan is a big fish, who had nothing particularly to do with demons. And Belial is a variation on the Canaanite god Baal, mm-hmm. And so on. So that this was sort of 19th century grab-ass Kabbalism. But for whatever reason, the 4 names got, sort of plonked in place as the 4 crown princes of hell. And Anton just picked that up and used that to section off the Satanic Bible roughly into an initial statement by Satan, a philosophical section, the Book of Lucifer, a sort of a Boy Scout handbook, how to do magic section called Belial, and then Leviathan was just sort of some incantations themselves, and including the Enochian keys that you could sort of plug into your ritual work. So that's how those names came together. And I, for the sake of tradition, I used the same 4 names here, explaining them again a little bit about the Mather's background and so on. And then I also gave them these new subtitles myself, the glory of fire, the glory of air, the glory of earth, the glory of water. And then for the new one, for the Yankee Rose one, it was the glory of darkness, sort of a punctuation, So that was a little tweak of mine, just to add a little bit more glamour flavor to it.
Well, and by adding that 5th section, so you had the 4 sections with the elements, like from the original, but now you have a 5th section, it corresponds with the pentagram.
Sure. Well, and indeed, one of the things that this gets into a lot more than the original Satanic Bible, of course, is the old sigil of Baphomet, that appeared on the cover and was the trademark, or not the trademark, but the insignia that we used for the Church of Satan. And like so many other things in the Church of Satan, nobody had really questioned the Baphomet. Well, where did this come from? Why does it look like this? Why is Leviathan's name on it instead of Satan, and so on? Mm-hmm. And we just used it. It was there. I mean, it attracted Anton's attention because he had this big old book called I don't think it was the History of Magic, but it was a big compendium of coffee table book about magic by a Frenchman named Maurice Bessy. And on the cover, it was this big black book, and it had this big silver emblem on the front cover. And it was a book that you see him posing with in a lot of pictures at the time because it looked nice and sinister. And he just said, well, that's a good emblem. Let's use that for the Church of Satan. So we did. But again, nobody did a whole lot of thinking about it. But in the appendices to this, there are 4 appendices back there, and one of them I take up the history of the Baphomet from the times of the Knights Templar on up to the present time, and relate its history and explain some of the things about it. And I said, well, when Bessie got around to it, the name of Satan in Hebrew has 4 letters, and he needed something with 5, so he looked around, and Leviathan happened to have 5 letters, so that's how come Leviathan wound up there, and that was that, So to make it on the fun side, when we got to the back of this, I showed some of my personal redoodlings of it. Both Anton and I played with the emblem over the years, and some funny stories in there too, of course. And I didn't like the way the goat looked. He looked like he'd run into a tree or something. His nose was all, So this was back in around 1972 or whatever. I was priest in Louisville, Kentucky, and I didn't have a goat around, so I drafted my Irish setter, Brandy, and I said, you just sit there and let me, sketch you. So Brandy said, okay, give me a milk bone and you're on. And And so I created a kind of a brandy met, which was a nicer looking nosed Baphomet figure who didn't look like he'd run into a tree. And then, of course, later on I was saying, well, I wonder what I can do about the Leviathan, which doesn't fit. I said Satan fits, but when I tried plugging just the English alphabet in there, it just didn't have the je ne sais quoi. It needs something spooky and mysterious there. And, of course, nobody can read Hebrew except maybe a few rabbis or something. So when you have 5 weird Hebrew letters there, it looks spooky, like the Enochian keys. But if you just put Satan there, it looks dorky. I'm sorry. It just doesn't do it.
Right.
So I had to look around and find a nice spooky alphabet, which I eventually did, and I just replaced it with Satan, and it looks fine,
Mm-hmm.
But I used the old one for this book throughout, just for the sake of tradition, because that's the way we used the emblem, during the time of the Church of Satan.
Yeah, and speaking of Leviathan, which I am a big fan, one of the things that you talk about that you focus on in your Leviathan section is the Book of Enoch and the backstory of the Book of Enoch, which I think is really great because there's so many people don't know anything about that. Everyone knows about the Enochian keys. Everyone has heard of the Enochian keys, has some familiarity, but there's such a lack of knowledge about Enoch and where any of this stuff comes from. And the things that have grown from that too, which is a lot of the mythology about the black flame.
Yeah, well, I set out to, among other things, as I said, I set out to, when I say backstory, I mean kind of that. In other words, you sort of look at these words that flash by you and say, well, where did this word come from? Where is it meaning? Who is this guy Enoch? Why were there keys named after him? Why should we care? And so on. And then you just start doing researching on this, and then you find out all this stuff. And that's why I put it all in the backstory there, so that people understand what Enoch was all about. And, of course, there was quite a big section in there of all the people who've screwed around with the Enochian keys, over the decades, trying to figure them out, make sense of them, including myself, including, finally, the Word of Set working that I did, that, as far as I'm concerned, brings everything into real clarity, real crystal clear meaning, and that's what's reproduced here. But the original text of the thing, as John D. wrote it down, was all distorted in the Golden Dawn books and in the Crowley books and in the Satanic Bible. And I didn't realize this until one of our early members in the Temple of Set, who was in England, said, how would you like to have the original texts of the Enochian keys? And I said, well, sure. He says, I can get them for you on microfiche, from the British Museum. And I said, cool, because that's where they're stored, And so I got this big, giant package of microfilm or microfiche, printed it out, and what you're reading in this book is the exact image of the Enochian keys in Enochian, the way John D. personally wrote them down in his journals.
Wow. That's amazing. And so the story of Enoch, like I said, it brings about a lot about the black flame. And so looking at it in that perspective, there's a lot of that. Do you consider there's a lot of that energy that comes through the keys?
Well, I think, as I said, in the Word of Set working, it's a statement, in this case by Set, or the Prince of Darkness, concerning the conscious evolution of humanity, and the symbolism of the black flame is a sort of the Promethean rendition of it, as we would express it, like the flame of Prometheus, that brought wisdom, or the Garden of Eden, the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that means that you're no longer just a a mechanism of stimulus response instinct, but suddenly you're a conscious being that can. The phrase that I like to use is to assign meaning to phenomena, and that's what a God can do. A God looks out at something and says, "I now assign significance and meaning and interpretation to this thing, and to the extent that I convey that to others, that's an act of divinity." So, we, of course, in the Temple of Set, refer to this as the gift of Set, this sense of self-awareness and our ability to assign meanings to things and to create things, that either from composite things that existed before or from completely new things. And that is if you really want to look at it, hardly and carefully, that's what being a God is all about, is creation and assigning meanings to things. So that's where that enters into it. And you can call it the black flame, you can call it the fire of Prometheus, you can call it the gift of Set. It's all the same thing. It's this. I go into a bit of the history of humanity in here. And, of course, this all takes place somewhere in the missing link period of human evolution, where you had something that started out as just one more animal on the planet, and somewhere in there, whether it was a monolith in 2001 or what, there was an event or a development or an aberration that switched us over into being conscious beings and beings capable of assigning meaning and assigning values, which is where we are. And that's what makes us significant. That's why we aren't dogs and cats and trees and things like this. The difference of us is that we assign meanings to things.
Do you believe that there was intervention with mankind during that time period from an alien source?
I think it's pretty much inescapable that there has to be an externality involved here. Things don't create themselves. When I go into this in my book Mind Star in considerable depth, I think, because there is, Plato first developed this as his theory of the forms, that there's an original cosmic principle of manifestation or reality, and that it particularizes itself in various physical entities or phenomena. And what we have come to understand as Satan or Set is the universal form of isolate self-consciousness, which is particularized in people like you and like me. So it's not so much that something just kind of reached out like the blue fairy in Pinocchio and said, you're a boy instead of a puppet. It's more that we're a kind of a living extension and physical manifestation of this ongoing universal principle. So that we, when people say, well, where is Set? He's in you. I mean, he's of you. You're Set. You're not the only Set, but you're an extension, a manifestation, a particularization of Set, just like you are of Satan. That's when in Satan's foreword to this Bible, he says, you want to meet God? Go look in the mirror. Okay? And it's quite serious. But you have to understand what being a God is all about. It isn't just saying, oh, look in the mirror, I see an old guy with a white beard, like Gandalf or something. Well, nope. That has nothing to do with it. To be a God is to be an independent, isolate thing with self-consciousness and will. And that's where all this kind of comes together.
So are all human beings potentially gods?
Well, yes, and the magic word there is potentially, because people can go through life and be stimulus response robots, and a lot of people do. They just kind of bounce through life. Something hits them and they hit back. whether they get hungry and they have to work so they can go buy food, or whatever. And that's as far as they want to go. They don't want to really look into the reasons for this, the whys. And indeed, the whole world, the whole realm of conventional science has nothing to do with why. It has everything to do with how.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take science classes in high school or college, they'll say, okay, well, if you mix chemical A and chemical B together and you get an explosion or something like this, so that's the how. So we now understand the formulas and we understand how the planets go around each other and so on. But as soon as some kid says, well, why is this happening? The teacher just says, shut up. We don't know why it's happening. It's just there. That's not our job. We're just telling you how this machinery is functioning so that you can predict, whether the sun's going to come up tomorrow or so on. But we have no idea why things are set up the way they are. So the whole idea of metaphysics gets into the why. And religion, conventional religion, is kind of a cheap shot at that. It just comes up with some grab-ass fairy tales and says, oh, there was a god or there was a bunch of gods, so they created things like this, and they did it to be mean, or they did it for the fun of it, or because they were bored, or just they created people so they'd have something to jerk around, or whatever. But it's all very puerile stuff. I mean, when I was a kid, my parents said, well, we should probably send him around to a few Sunday schools in case he needs some kind of religious education, And they sent me around to a few different Sunday schools, all of which interested me about as much as Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny did. But I didn't. There was nothing there that intrigued me that I was suddenly getting an explanation of what's real and what's behind all this.
Mm-hmm.
That actually is why I got interested in the Church of Satan, because when I went to one of Anton's lectures that he was giving for the public in 1969, yes, he was having fun with himself, and yes, he was, being Mr. Spooky and so on. I said to myself, I think this guy has actually got a grip with his fingernails or something, but he's got a grip on what's really going on here. What's the mystery of the universe, And I want to find out more about that, so I'm going to get more involved with this, and that's sort of how I became more involved with that. The whole concept of black magic, of Satanism, has to do with finding out the why and finding it out and being able to control various parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the great secret there, you might say.
I feel that most of the religions, the right-hand path religions, the great religions of the world, the popular religions, that at one time when they were starting out, they were basically esoteric systems where people were trying to, for that time period, for where man was and where knowledge was, they were trying to express metaphysical truths, but over time they became under the control of centralized authority systems. Enough people got involved with them and realized that they could be good mechanisms for controlling people. So they became about controlling people, telling people, to be obedient and to do this and, go to church and to, who you can have sex with and things like that.
Well, when we were a young, stupid race of intelligent animals, everything around us was mysterious. You didn't know what this big glowing thing was in the daytime or what the lighter glowing thing was in the nighttime. So people would come up with fairy tales, and legends to explain these things. And to some extent, they could be used for predictive purposes. I mean, if you began to figure out what was going on up in the heavens with the movement of the zodiac and so on, then you could tell what time it was that the Nile was going to overflow, or that it was a good time to plant things, so that they'd blossom, in springtime and so on. So gradually, science replaced these earliest religious myths in terms of what's happening when. But science did not address the why, never did. And religion never tried to go anywhere, conventional religion, with the why either. It's just stuck with these old myths. I think there is a certain amount of fear in there because I think that probably most ordinary people are unprepared to ask the question why. They're afraid of the answer. The idea, for example, of being told that you're sort of your own God and responsible for your own morality is profoundly terrifying to some people. They want to be pet dogs of a controlling God, even if it's a nasty God, like the Hebrew one. As long as there's somebody telling them what to do and saying you don't really want to concern yourself with this. It's a little bit like Dorothy and Oz the Great and Terrible, and don't look behind the curtain. Just to pay attention to the big speaking head up there. Don't pay no attention to the little guy behind the curtain. And a very important. I can't overestimate the value and the importance of George Orwell's 1984 because in it he really, really goes at the guts of human society and human interactions, and he just tears this thing a whole new asshole, if you'll pardon the pun. There's one point at there where he's questioning Winston Smith, his torture subject, so to speak, and he says, "Now explain to me, so why does the party exercise control, and power like it does over this totalitarian society?" And Winston sort of says, "Well, you're ruling over us for our own good because you think that humans are too stupid to know what's best for them." And suddenly he screams out in pain because O'Brien has just twisted the torture device and given him a shock. And O'Brien says, "That was stupid, Winston, stupid." So I'll tell you the answer. The object of power is power. You seize power for its own sake, to exercise it, because that's what you do with power. It says it has nothing to do with altruism per se. It's its own thing. And then if you have your own ethics, they're your own ethics, but it's certainly not something that you're obedient to some externalized God, like for 10 Commandments and stuff like that. And the whole of 1984 is a great wake-up pill. It's a big red pill in the metaphor of the Matrix to take so many myths, of social functioning and just sort of tear them apart and show them on all their rawness and their reality. There's one point there where one of the fellow party members, his name is Syme, is explaining some of these guts of the system to Winston Smith over lunch, and Winston Smith, he suddenly reflects to himself. He says, "One of these days, Syme is going to be vaporized. He sees too clearly and he speaks too plainly. The party does not like such people. One of these days he will disappear. It is written in his face." Sometimes I feel a little bit like Syme, and I'm just a little, when sometimes when people attack me or go after me, I say to myself, well, I see too clearly and I speak too plainly, and some people can't handle that.
Yeah.
And I'll probably get some of the same, for this. There are a lot of people who are only happy with the Satanic Bible because it was a fairly elementary thing that Anton did in 1968 that they can be sort of dismissive of and put in its place, kind of like wearing an old pair of Levi's that's become comfortable. And to suddenly be confronted with a far more sophisticated Satanic Bible that goes into the why of things in reality is going to shake up some people, I think. And suddenly it's sort of doing what its title implies that it should, as Satan says in his foreword to this. I invited Stanton, Anton's grandson, to do an afterword, and he said, "Well, that's kind of an honor, considering who Michael got to do the foreword." So, okay.
I think that's so awesome that Stanton was involved with this, and I really loved what he wrote in it. And I'd met Stanton myself like some years ago, like in 2005 or so, when my band Asmodeus X was playing in Hollywood. He came out to one of the shows, and I met him there. And he's just a really, really cool guy. And so it's just really great seeing him involved with this.
I'll tell you one of the oddities that there's no really place to mention it in the book or anything, but I only met him for the first time maybe a year or so ago, and when we got together and had lunch, the first thing that struck me is this guy not only looks like Anton LaVey, but he sounds like him, and his mannerisms are just like Anton's.
Is that right?
He's got the same voice. He's got the same way of speaking. He's got that same sort of pause to his inflections in the way that he says things. He's a very polite person, very respectful, deferential, and so on. But he looks for all the world like Anton LaVey, age 30 or 35. And it's creepy.
Yeah.
I've remarked that. I say to him occasionally when I said, well, as you know, your grandmother Diane and Anton didn't exactly break up under friendly circumstances. I said, and he's close to Diane. I said, just remember that if suddenly, for no reason, Diane just sort of hauls off and socks you, don't take it personally. You just look too damn much, and you sound too damn much like Anton LaVey. And I don't think he's affecting this. I mean, he obviously affects the look to some point where he grows a bit of a beard and shaves his head and so on, and and dresses in black and all this. But there's a lot of his personal mannerisms that he wouldn't have known Anton well enough to try to emulate. But somehow the DNA or whatever it is peeking through there, and it's, as I said, it's kind of funny and it's slightly creepy in a way.
That's amazing. So you've also included something in this Satanic Bible called the Ninth Solstice Message. Can you tell me a little bit about that, and what sort of change are you looking to bring about with it?
Well, the Ninth Solstice Message was a kind of a spontaneous thing that happened on the ninth solstice, the solstice, the north solstice of the year 9, which would have been 1974. And the Church of Satan was undergoing a variety of different kinds of growing pains at that time, and directional considerations, you might say. So I didn't set out to answer anything, but I was doing a greater black magic working on the ninth solstice, and then I began writing this thing down in much the same way as I'd written down the Diabolicon many years previously, except this was just a one-piece thing. For want of something more interesting to call it, I just referred to it as the Ninth Solstice Message. And I sent this up to Anton and said, here's this, and he sent a note back to me, which I reproduce in the book here, in which he essentially accepted it, said it's very cybernetic, an interesting turn of phrase, in its appearance and timing, and basically accepted its authenticity. One of the interesting things about it is that it mentions a pact that he had made with Satan. And I asked Anton about that. I'd never heard anything about that. Next time I was up in San Francisco, and he said, well, yes, when I was going to start out the church, I wrote a formal pact with Satan, and I'll show it to you. And he went down into the basement and came up with his strong box in which he kept his personal papers, and there was this handwritten pact, with Satan that he had it was entitled. I didn't get a copy of it or anything, but I remember at the top of it, it was just simply entitled "My Pact," and it was all handwritten out by Anton, and it was his personal oath and dedication to Satan, and he had obviously taken it seriously enough and kept it all those years, so that it was right there in his most important personal papers. So that was an interesting side effect of this to me, because I'd never heard about that before and didn't know about it when the Ninth Solstice message was being written out. So I put that in there as again, a piece of history that sort of puts things in context in the year 1974, which of course was the year before the Church of Satan came to its dead end. And I didn't really comment on it there. I'll just put it out there, let people, okay, there it is, take it for what it's worth, pretty much like Anton did.
Well, we all know by now that amazing things happen when Michael Aquino decides to just put things out there.
I'm a curious guy. People occasionally ask me, well, how'd you get into this stuff? Why did you get interested in devil worship or magic or Satanism? And I said, well, I've always wanted to figure out what's going on. I want to know about the mysteries of the universe, and if I figure something out or if I discover something, I kind of like to share it.
Mm-hmm.
And that explains me. I mean, I mentioned in there, that some people got involved with the Church of Satan because they had a bad time with Christianity or whatever, and so they wanted to get even, or they wanted to get rich or get a girl or something. Okay, I can understand people who had motivations this way and that way. My motivation was just to find out what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have a bug up my ass about anything previously. I'd never had any previous strong religious affiliations of any sort. I just thought Christianity was another fairy tale. And I didn't really have a like or dislike about it any more than I had a dislike or like of the Easter Bunny, or the Tooth Fairy. It was just there.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always been a curious guy. And when I got to this point, and Stanton said, well, why don't you just rewrite a Satanic Bible? And I said, well, I'm not a Satanist. He says, so what? He says, you can do this because you understand this better than anybody else around, so why don't you just do it? Well, yeah, okay. So that's how this book, kind of came into existence. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who'll say, you're just trying to, steal the Satanic Bible, And I said, well, no, because there's nothing in here that's in Anton's. And besides, I give due credit and due tribute where its tribute is due and stuff to the original volume and so on. So I don't see that as a problem. But there are a lot of people who aren't going to like the fact that this is a mirror being held up to them. And again, the Temple of Set is a small esoteric initiatory system. It's not a mass religion. Never could be. Never has been. I mean, and I've never assumed that it would be. It's always going to be a very, very intense initiatory experience. Like the young priest in Herbach going through initiation. It's a one-on-one thing for only a very limited number of people who happen to have this potential in themselves and a consuming desire to actualize it. But out there, we're still surrounded in what's largely a Judeo-Christian metaphor society. So the Church of Satan was a mass organization, and Satanism can be a mass philosophy or a mass ideological system. So there's a place for a Satanic Bible that kind of outlines it that way, just like there is a place for something called the Boy Scout Handbook to teach people how to be Boy Scouts. Mm-hmm. So this is supposed to be a kind of a Boy Scout handbook, for ordinary society out there, for the people who aren't satisfied with the menu of ordinary religions that are out there, but don't know how to do Satanism and there's nothing to teach them how to be Satanists anymore except this.
Yeah, I feel that there's nothing in, and you're right. There's going to be some pushback. There's going to be some blowback out there, but there's nothing in this Satanic Bible that really that refutes or denigrates or disrespects in any way anything from the initial Satanic Bible. It simply, if anything, it alleviates some ambiguities. It highlights certain aspects, and it delves in deeper and expands many aspects of it. So I can't. I hesitate to do this. I don't want you to take this in the wrong way, but I kind of almost look at it like, the old Battlestar Galactica series and then the new Battlestar Galactica series, right? It's not like one's not better than the other. The first one could only be what it was, being made in 1978, and the new series could only be, the new series, and then have the opportunity to go way, way beyond it. And I love both of the series. I value both of them like very highly. So there's no need to say, oh, I like this one better than the other one. It's a reiteration of something and an expansion of something, and it's just revealing the potentials that were always kind of there in the original one, but the original just didn't, because it was the 70s. There's only so much they could do, So that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, well, I of course saw the original Battlestar Galactica. I wasn't too taken up with the subsequent one, I guess because I sort of didn't like the way they remorphed some of the characters to be politically correct and so on. But I could see them trying to develop some of the subtle and more sophisticated things in it, because the original one was comic booky, and it was a very obvious surfboard on Star Wars. Glenn Larson is trying to make a TV series, that would take off on that, just the way Star Trek got revived by Star Wars and came back with a bunch of movies. It would never have happened if it hadn't been for the Star Wars phenomenon. And I see this as again as a kind of a clarification of a concept. I'm not at all. I have no conscience bothers at all about following up on the Anton LaVey one. And as I said, I think that if, for example, if people like Stanton and Diane had looked at this project that way, they would both have kicked my ass, and neither of them did, And Diane's reaction was kind of cute. She more or less said, "Boy, this guy has balls, try and do this." But I don't see it as, in the least, as a disrespectful thing, but I see it as a project, as I said, that if he were around, Anton would have been the first one to get involved with and to kind of like it the way it turns out,
I have to ask a question, too. In Anton LaVey's letter that he wrote back to you in response to the Ninth Solstice message, he says the follow-up to the Diabolicon is cybernetic. What is that word he put there?
I can't. You can make it that what you want to. I can't get inside his head either.
We don't know what.
No, I don't know. I don't know exactly what he meant, except that I think he assumed that it was a significant term. He certainly didn't reject the document, and he considered it, if you go further down, as a strong validation on my own credentials as a Satanist. So of course, the beginning of the note refers to something else completely. It refers to some an interview or question and answers that I'd given to some lady journalist who I'd recently spoken with. So that has nothing to do with anything. It just happened to be something he mentioned in the first part of the same note. That's all.
That's weird. I'm looking at the word, and I'm like, is that cybernetic? Do I just want to say it's cybernetic because we were just talking about Battlestar Galactica?
Well, at the beginning of the computer age, words like cybernetics were all the rage. I mean, it's sort of a passé term now, but those were the days when people were writing books about this wonderful new thing called the IBM 650 computer that took up rooms and rooms and rooms and rooms, And I remember when I was going through the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and we were touring some of these big cybernetic, these computer installation things. We visited Cray Computers, and Cray made these gigantic supercomputers that looked like huge donuts in these big rooms, and these computers were so overwhelming and so gigantic in their processing, they actually had the things submerged in liquid oxygen because the speed of the electrons moving around in them was so high that these things would have just melted into goo, in normal air-conditioned room temperatures. So they had to actually have them down to, liquid oxygen freezing levels to enable them to function. Today we've got more power than that in an iPhone. So terms like cybernetics were this ooh ah, back in the early 1970s. Today they're sort of almost forgotten, and we live in an age of apps.
Well, excellent. So people can buy the Satanic Bible 50th Anniversary Revision from Amazon?
Well, right now it's just available in the Lulu store because I published it through Lulu. So it's lulu.com. That's LULU.com.
Okay.
And it's also going to be out there in the worldwide Amazon network system and in Barnes & Noble and all the rest of that. But Lulu wants me to take a look at the first printed copy first and make sure that everything's right with it. So I'm still waiting to get my first printed copy of it, and if I bless that and I find that they didn't print the cover upside down or something, then I'll just say, okay, go ahead, you can release the whole thing, and then it'll be out there, on Amazon and everything else. Right now it's just available within the Lulu system. Right. You can get it, but as I said, I haven't physically, I've proofed it as well as I can online, but I actually have to hold the thing in my hands and make sure that it looks the way it should and that everything's positioned right and stuff like that, and then I'll give them the go-ahead.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I definitely want all of my listeners to watch for this and to check out the Satanic Bible 50th Year Revision and also any of the other many awesome books by Michael Aquino. All of them are very in-depth and will make you a smarter human being. And what is next for Michael Aquino?
Well, I'm suffering from frail health at this point and also from advanced macular degeneration of my eyesight. So I'm even surprised that I was able to get through constructing this Satanic Bible because it takes a lot of eyeball work, to do books. But fortunately, I can still function on a brightly backlit computer screen. But I'm fast approaching the point where even that probably won't be open to me anymore. So this may well be the last book that I've done. Fortunately, in all the 16 books that I've done so far, I've said the stuff that's most important to me that I think that other people will find valuable and useful to them. So I'm completely content with what I've got out there. This sort of came up as a last-minute burp, by surprise. And I struggled through it, staring pretty hard at the screen, to make sure that I could see everything as well as I could. So I think it came through okay and is spelled correctly and formatted right. But I don't think I can write any more books, unfortunately. I think unless I'm greatly surprised, I think this is probably the last thing that I could physically do that way.
Well, we sure are thankful that this has come into being as it is. And so just know that, we all love you. We all appreciate all the gems you throw out to us, and any future gems you might throw our way, we're going to love those too. So wish you the...
Well, I thank you for that. And as I said, I hope that people enjoy this book, that they find it a good, a worthy thing to read and to provoke some good adventures on their parts. Everybody has a bit of Indiana Jones in them, and all you have to do is sort of dangle an Ark of the Covenant or something out there, and then people will go out and try and find it. So here's another dangle. If you're interested in Satanism, but you didn't really have a clear picture of it, and the old Satanic Bible didn't quite do it for you, particularly since the organization fizzled and flopped. Here's something you can take a fresh look at and maybe go someplace with. And for example, Stanton has said that he might try to recreate a new concept of a Church of Satan and use this book as a sort of a launching pad, a kind of a backbone for its constitution and so on. So this, it's just to see what happens, as it were.
Yeah. No, like I said, I know something's going to come from this. Something completely unexpected, and just bizarre. I know is going to come from this. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens and grows from it as we move forward into the unknowable future.
Well, the most interesting thing is, like Enzo Ferrari used to be asked, what's your favorite car, and of all the ones that you're responsible for, and he says, the one I build tomorrow. So that was his response to that.
There you go. All right. Well, Michael, we've had a good long conversation here.
I thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it too, and I hope people had some questions answered and got some interesting things to think about. And of course, I hope people who decide to pick up the book enjoy it, learn from it, and have a good time with it.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. And Kefir.
Thank you, Kefir.